For most of what we call human history, nothing happens. No cities rise, no kings rule, no temples dominate the skyline, no written words survive to tell us who we were. And yet, humans have existed for more than 300,000 years. Civilization, as it is usually defined, appears only in the last 5,000. That means over 95% of our story is dismissed with a single word: prehistory. A word that does not mean primitive, it only means unrecorded. So the question is not why civilization began. The more unsettling question is why it took so long. For hundreds of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans hunted, migrated, raised children, buried their dead, created art, and told stories, without cities, without writing, without agriculture. We are told this was a waiting period, a long, silent rehearsal before the real story began. But silence in the archaeological record does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means something existed that did not leave the kinds of traces we know how to recognize. What if this vast stretch of time was not an age of ignorance, but an age we no longer understand? Because scattered across the world are signs that do not fit comfortably into the simple narrative of progress. Symbols carved where survival alone should have mattered. Monuments built before farming should have allowed them. Knowledge passed on without books, without stone, without permanence. If civilization is the triumph of memory, then what came before it may have been something else entirely. To understand that forgotten age, we first have to understand the story we tell ourselves about how civilization began. According to the conventional timeline, humans lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years. Life was short, uncertain, and dictated by nature. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something changed. Humans learned to domesticate plants and animals. Agriculture created food surpluses. Surpluses led to permanent settlements. Settlements grew into cities. Cities demanded administration. Administration produced writing. And with writing, history begins. Everything before it is grouped together as a single, undifferentiated past. Stone tools, animal bones, and scattered campsites. A long prologue to the real human story. This framework is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because it quietly assumes that complexity only exists where it leaves durable remains. Stone and clay survive. Wood, fiber, leather, song, and spoken knowledge do not. A society that builds in stone is visible to us. A society that builds in memory is almost invisible. And yet, the humans of this forgotten age were not biologically inferior to us. They had the same brains, the same capacity for language, the same emotional depth, the same ability to imagine futures that did not yet exist. Archaeology itself tells us this. Long before agriculture, humans were already using pigments not for survival, but for meaning. They were burying their dead with care. They were shaping objects whose purpose was symbolic rather than practical. These are not the behaviors of creatures waiting to become human. They are the behaviors of people who already were. So why did they not build cities? Why did they not write? Why does civilization appear so suddenly, so late, and so unevenly across the world? One possibility is that we are not looking at the beginning of something, but the aftermath of something else. Because when history finally begins, it does not emerge from a stable, abundant world. It appears after upheaval, after climate instability, after rising seas erased coastlines where humans had lived for millennia. Civilization may not be the moment humanity woke up. It may be the moment humanity began to remember after forgetting something far older. And if that is true, then the age before civilization was not empty time. It was a different way of being human.
If the story ended with hunter-gatherers waiting patiently for agriculture, the evidence would be simple. But it isn't. As archaeologists began looking more closely at the deep past, they started finding signs that did not fit the idea of a long, stagnant prelude to civilization. These were not isolated mistakes or anomalies. They appeared again and again across continents, separated by thousands of years. Long before farming, humans were already thinking symbolically. In caves across Africa and Eurasia, pigments were mined, transported, and ground into fine powders. Ochre was not food. It did not make tools sharper or shelters stronger. It carried meaning, identity, ritual, memory. Some pieces were engraved with repeated geometric patterns, suggesting shared symbols passed between generations. Shell beads tell a similar story. They appear far inland, hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Someone carried them. Someone valued them enough to keep them close. These were not random decorations. They were signals of belonging, status, or belief. And then there is art. The cave paintings of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira are not crude experiments. They are confident, deliberate works, composed with an understanding of movement, perspective, and narrative. Many were painted deep underground, far from daily life, in places that required planning, lighting, and shared purpose. These are not the traces of minds waiting to awaken. They are the traces of cultures already awake. Even more unsettling is the evidence for organization. Long before cities, humans maintained trade networks stretching hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources appears far from its origin. This required not just travel, but social trust, negotiation, and memory. Knowledge was moving, people were connected. And then, at the edge of what we thought possible, stands Göbekli Tepe. In southeastern Anatolia, massive stone pillars rise from the earth, carved with animals, symbols, and abstract forms. Some weigh more than 20 tons. They were quarried, transported, and erected with precision. The problem is not what Göbekli Tepe is. The problem is when it is. It was built over 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent settlements. According to the old model, this should not exist. Who organized hundreds of people to carve and move stone without kings, cities, or surplus food? What belief system was powerful enough to mobilize such effort? Why were these structures deliberately buried after centuries of use? Göbekli Tepe does not answer questions. It creates them, and it forces a reconsideration of the forgotten age. Because what emerges is not a picture of simple survival, but of societies that were mobile, adaptive, and deeply knowledgeable about their environment. These humans did not dominate nature through force. They negotiated with it through timing, movement, and restraint. They followed animal migrations. They understood seasonal cycles. They read landscapes the way later civilizations would read texts. Memory did not live in books. It lived in stories, rituals, and shared experience. Oral traditions were not casual entertainment. They were technologies, methods of storing and transmitting vast amounts of information. Navigation, law, history, cosmology, and survival strategies were encoded in myth and repetition. What could not be remembered did not survive. This way of life thrived for tens of thousands of years. Then the world changed. At the end of the last ice age, the climate entered a period of instability. Temperatures rose sharply, ice sheets melted, Sea levels climbed more than 100 meters, swallowing coastlines where humans had lived for millennia. Entire landscapes vanished, rivers changed course, ecosystems collapsed, megafauna disappeared. For mobile societies tied to precise environmental knowledge, this was not a challenge, it was a rupture. Memory anchored to place became unreliable, routes no longer led where they once had, seasons no longer behaved as expected, and when the land itself forgets, humans must adapt or break. It is after this upheaval that agriculture spreads, not as a triumph, but as a response. Farming is not freedom, it is dependency. It ties humans to land that must now be controlled, defended, and managed. Cities rise not because they are ideal, but because they are necessary. Writing appears not as an artistic flourish, but as an administrative tool. Grain must be counted, labor recorded, authority justified. Civilization in this light is not the natural culmination of human intelligence. It is an emergency strategy. And with it comes forgetting. Oral knowledge fragments under scale, rituals lose context, stories harden into myths. What was once lived becomes symbolic. Gods replace ancestors. Allegories replace instructions. The old world fades, not because it was weak, but because it was incompatible with the new conditions. This reframes the entire story. The forgotten age was not a failure to advance, it was a different solution to being human. An age optimized for balance, memory, and resilience, until the world itself shifted beneath it. Modern civilization, then, is not the beginning of history. It is what remains after something vast was lost. And perhaps this is why myths of golden ages, floods, and fallen worlds appear everywhere, not as fantasies, but as distorted memories of a time when humans lived differently, thought differently, and measured success by survival rather than accumulation. The silence before civilization is not empty. It is full of voices we no longer know how to hear. And the question that remains is not whether this forgotten age existed, but what it asks of us now. Because if humanity has reinvented itself before, under pressure and loss, then civilization is not an endpoint. It is a phase, one that, like all others, may not last forever.